What kind of crime could possibly justify a punishment so gruesome that it left the condemned twisted, shattered, and displayed like a grotesque warning to all who passed? In medieval Europe, the answer was chillingly simple: anything that challenged authority, order, or the very fabric of society. Known as the breaking wheel, or Raiden in German-speaking regions, this method of execution was not merely a punishment, it was a spectacle of annihilation. It was reserved for those deemed beyond redemption: murderers, highway robbers, traitors, and, in certain territories, even those accused of sorcery or heresy. The act had to be public, intentional, and disruptive. Crimes that shook the moral or political foundations of a kingdom. The breaking wheel saw widespread use in the Holy Roman Empire, France, and parts of Eastern Europe as a punishment for severe crimes. In France, its application was formally codified under the Code Louis, 1670, though the method had been practiced long before. While some accounts suggest early instances of the wheel's use, including a disputed 9th century reference to King Charles the Bald, the earliest definitive legal records appear in the 13th century. The Sachsenspiegel, a German legal code compiled by Eike von Repgau, explicitly prescribed the wheel for unprovoked murderers, stating, "He who commits a murder on the road, without feud or cause, shall be broken upon the wheel." Notably, the wheel was not used indiscriminately. Medieval society was deeply hierarchical, and class determined not only privilege but also the manner of death. Nobles were usually spared the wheel, executed instead by sword or axe, a more honourable death. The wheel was for the common man, the peasant, the outsider, the one whose life was considered expendable. Historical court records from 16th century Saxony show that even petty crimes could lead to the wheel if the criminal was a repeat offender or had incited fear in the community. Serial thefts, multiple assaults, or arson during times of famine or war were sometimes enough. The punishment was also often applied with additional cruelty if the victim of the crime had social or political importance. This brutal justice was as much about deterrence as it was about punishment. The wheel was a slow, deliberate process meant to break more than just the body. It was designed to crush the soul publicly, irrevocably. Dragged to the square, the final walk to the wheel. There was no quiet end for the condemned. Once sentenced to die by the wheel, the final journey began not with mercy, but with humiliation. Stripped of all dignity and rights, the prisoner was paraded through the streets, often barefoot, bloodied from prior beatings, and sometimes already half-naked. This was not just an execution. It was an act of public theatre, staged to imprint fear into the collective conscience. In the Holy Roman Empire, this procession typically led from the city jail to a raised scaffold or execution site outside the town walls. Known as the Hochgericht, the High Court, these places were intentionally elevated, visible from afar, chosen so that the fate of the criminal could be witnessed by all. Church bells sometimes rang during the march, not for the soul of the condemned, but to alert townspeople of the spectacle about to unfold. Eyewitness records from 16th century Nuremberg and Frankfurt describe these processions in grim detail. The criminal was bound, sometimes forced to carry the wheel or a wooden cross as a final humiliation. Along the route, jeering crowds hurled insults, rotten food, and even stones. Children watched. Priests followed close behind, urging repentance while holding up crucifixes. In Catholic territories, the condemned might be offered a final confession, but in many cases it came too late. If the crime was especially severe, such as the killing of a noble, an act of sacrilege or rebellion, the condemned individual might be subjected to additional suffering along the way. In some cases, heated metal instruments were used to inflict injuries on the limbs prior to arrival at the place of execution. According to 17th century French records, Such measures were occasionally employed in cases involving parricide or regicide. Every step of this process was outlined in a Strafordnung, or official sentencing order, ensuring that the punishment not only upheld legal standards but also reflected the emotional intensity of public sentiment. By the time the scaffold was reached, many condemned were barely able to stand. Yet the executioner, known in German as the Scharfrichter, was bound by law and tradition to read aloud the crimes before administering the sentence. In some cities, a town crier would proclaim, "By order of the law and the emperor's justice, this man shall be broken on the wheel for his wicked deeds." The condemned was then laid out, arms stretched, legs bound, body trembling, before being lashed to the wooden spokes that would soon become the instrument of their obliteration. Bone by bone, the process of the breaking wheel. Once the condemned reached the scaffold, the solemn ritual of the breaking wheel commenced. The executioner, equipped with a heavy wooden wheel, stood as a central figure in this judicial spectacle, carrying out his duties with methodical precision. For the condemned, this marked the final stage of their sentence, with no possibility of reprieve. The procedure served not just as punishment, but as a powerful warning to the gathered community. The breaking wheel itself was a substantial wooden apparatus with thick spokes radiating from an iron hub. While its design varied between regions, its purpose remained consistent: to completely restrain the condemned individual. The process began with the removal of the prisoner's outer garments, performed before the assembled spectators. Their limbs were then secured to the wheel's spokes, typically bound with ropes, though in some documented cases fastened more firmly, ensuring they remained in position throughout the ordeal. The executioner would methodically work through the limbs, employing an iron hammer or weighted mallet to systematically fracture the bones. Contemporary accounts, particularly from 15th century Nuremberg legal records, indicate the joints were specifically targeted, rendering the condemned completely immobilized. While the suffering was undoubtedly severe, the crowd typically observed in sober silence, witnessing the fulfillment of judicial sentence. For perpetrators of particularly grave offences, such as murder or treason, the punishment could be extended. Each limb received careful attention, with the executioner ensuring comprehensive application of the sentence. In certain jurisdictions like Saxony, and for especially notorious criminals, additional measures might be employed to intensify the punishment before a final merciful blow. These extreme cases sometimes resulted in prolonged exposure to the elements before death ultimately came. Aftermath: the fate of the body and the message of terror. Death by the wheel did not conclude with the final breath. For authorities across medieval and early modern Europe, the intended impact of the punishment extended well beyond the moment of execution. The remains, wounded, often difficult to recognize, were not interred with dignity, but instead displayed publicly as a warning, serving as a grim tool of social control. Following the execution, the body was typically placed atop the same wheel, which was then secured to a tall pole or wooden frame positioned on the outskirts of town, commonly at a crossroads or near the town's designated gallows field, known in German as the Galgenberg or Gallows Hill. This location was strategic. It ensured that both travelers and townspeople would regularly pass by and confront the visible remains of authorities' justice. Birds circled. Exposure to the elements gradually erased what had once been a person. Records from 16th century Saxony and Bavaria describe instances where remains were left in view for weeks or even months, slowly deteriorating while still bound to the wheel. There was no shroud, no coffin, and no formal burial. In many Christian communities, this refusal of burial was considered not only a physical rejection, but also a spiritual punishment, a final act of exclusion from both human society and divine grace. One of the most unsettling and widely cited accounts of this punishment was that of Christmann Jenipatenga, a German bandit and serial killer captured near Cologne in 1581. He was sentenced to death by the wheel, receiving the full series of prescribed blows as part of the punishment. What followed, however, was both extraordinary and deeply disturbing. Jenipatenga survived, not merely for hours, but for 9 full days. Still bound to the wheel, exposed to the open air, and denied food or water, he remained conscious and responsive throughout that time. Guards were stationed nearby to prevent anyone from offering aid. His prolonged endurance became a morbid spectacle, recorded in contemporary documents and later referenced by medical practitioners and historians as one of the most extreme examples of human survival under judicial suffering. Crucially, the refusal of burial was no oversight. It was a deliberate act of spiritual censure. In the Christian worldview of the time, burial in consecrated ground was essential for the soul's redemption. By denying this, the authorities sought not only to end a life, but to erase the legacy, severing the individual from both earthly community and eternal hope. The breaking wheel was more than punishment. It unveiled the darkest edges of human authority, leaving scars etched deep into civilization's memory. Its chilling legacy remains a stark reminder of justice turned to terror. Which current legal practice, born of deterrence, might future historians judge with equal horror? Comment below. As the ancient Roman jurist Seneca warned, all cruelty springs from weakness.